The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus journeyed to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd accompanied him. As he drew near to the gate of the city, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. A large crowd from the city was with her, and when the Lord saw her, he was moved with pity for her and said to her, "Do not weep." He stepped forward and touched the coffin. At this, the bearers halted, and he said, "Young man, I tell you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, exclaiming, "A great prophet has arisen in our midst, and God has visited his people." This report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding region. The Gospel of the Lord. One of the most common concerns of our life as disciples of Christ, our spiritual life, is how do we get to God? Jesus, we are assured, is the way, as well as the truth and the life. But then comes the practical question. How do we get to God? How do we live in such a way that we can approach the Almighty, the one who is the origin and source and the goal and end of our entire existence? That, I think, is the question that theologians try to answer. Theology has been described as faith seeking understanding. And the church has kind of often put its seal of approval on the writings and the teachings of theologians as being authentically seekers of understanding in the faith. And that's what the church did with St. Robert Bellarmine, who lived about 500 years ago, and at a time when it was very necessary to approach and address the mistakes, the errors, the false directions that the Protestant Reformation seemed to be going in. However, where theology reaches its limits in trying to understand God and understand faith, poetry and mysticism take over. So where theology ends, that really is where poetry and mysticism begin. It's relatively recently that the church has officially begun to recognize that, particularly in declaring certain mystics, not only saints, but also doctors of the church. And that goes for the two Teresas, Teresa of Avila and Therese of Lisieux, both declared doctors of the church, both not great theologians, but mystics who wrote in poetry, who used poetry to describe the undescribable. That is definitely the central greatness of Hildegard of Bingen, who could be regarded as one of the first really recognized women mystics in the church. Interestingly, she was never formally canonized, but within the last 10 years or so, Pope Benedict XVI acknowledged not only that we were correct in venerating her as a saint, but then declared her a doctor of the church, which basically said that all of her writings, all of her poetry, all of her mystical experiences and visions that she described are pointing us in the right direction. That, I think, is a very, very good reason why in our own day we need to take Hildegard seriously at the heart of our Catholic faith tradition. Not somebody who is interesting sort of over there on the fringe, and fringe-like people, sort of go after them. No, she's right at the heart. So that's why I think Hildegard is very important to us. And she models one thing. She has one statement that has been kind of pulled out of her writings, which she uses to describe herself, but really describes anyone who seriously wants to let the Lord take over in our life. Because let's face it, the goal of theology is to try to understand the things of God. The goal of mysticism is to open ourselves up to allow God to be God in our lives. And the magnificent way that she describes her own role there, and I think describes our role, is that she is a feather in the breath of God. We know that the value and beauty of a feather in our experience is that it allows itself to be lifted, even with a gentle breeze, to be lifted and moved about. And that really is our calling. Not just to try to get to God, but to let God get to us in a way that even the most gentle of movements of God's Spirit can truly move us as God wills. So our question might be today, following upon Hildegard, how well are we a feather in the breath of